Hello, good morning, and thank you for attending today's webinar. I'm sure quite a couple of you are following Melanie, who I've actually listened to her in the past. Just a bit of background regarding Melanie. She studied geology at the University of Stellenbosch, and interesting, she was also the only woman in the class at the time. In 1990, she had the privilege of meeting the late President Nelson Mandela. Shortly after that, she joined the ANC branch in Stellenbosch. In 1994, after the first democratic elections were held in South Africa, she was elected as a member of parliament for the ANC. And in 1999, she got re-elected as a member of parliament again. In 2001, she was appointed the ambassador of South Africa to Ireland, a position she retained up to 2005. In 2007 to 2011, she became the executive director of UNICEF in Ireland. And also in 2007, she was awarded the Irish Tatler International Women of the Year Award. In 2013, decided to become an independent political analyst and is currently rated as one of the top analysts in the country by Financial Mail. Melanie is also writing a weekly column in News 24 and has actually published several books throughout her career. Before I'm going to hand over to Melanie, I just want to cover the order of the proceedings for the next hour. Melanie is going to talk to us for about 30 minutes. She said she prefers a Q&A session, so shortly after that we'll have a question and answer session. The clients that have actually sent through the questions, thanks a lot for all the questions that we've received from you. And Melanie, as I've discussed with you, there's quite a couple of tough questions coming through from the clients as well. And then right at the end, Annette Hearn, the CEO of PSG Asset Management, will do a short conclusion. But before we start, we thought, let's run a poll. So the poll should appear on your screens any moment. And the question we're asking you is, if you look at South Africa, 10 years going forward, where do you believe we will be? The high road, the medium road, or the low road? I'll give you a couple seconds just to complete the poll. I think most might be done by now. So without further ado, I'm now going to hand over to Melanie. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you very much, Charles, and good morning, everybody, from a freezing Cape Town. I won't show you, but I'm sitting here under a little blanket and hot water bottles around me. It's very lovely to speak to you all, and thank you for having me. First of all, let me just do a little disclaimer. I know in the financial sector you're good with disclaimer, but let me just do mine. It is true that I was, of course, a member of the ANC and I was a member of Parliament, but it's just always important for me to say that I haven't been a member of the ANC since 2001. When I became ambassador, so it's been a long time, but of course I still have very, very close connections in the ANC from very high up, and I have a lot of friends there, so I do have a very good insight, I think, into what happens in the ANC, but I am under no obligation to push a line. I don't push a line. The ANC often gets very annoyed with me when I say certain critical things of them. I say it as I see it, and it's just important for me to say that, because sometimes when I say positive things, when I say negative things, people say, yeah, she really knows the ANC, but the moment I say something positive, they then say, oh, you see, she's just an ANC hack. I am not. So just wanted to say that. Having said that, I am going to focus most of my presentation on the governing party, and for exactly that reason, that they are the governing party. They determine the outcome of what really happens in this country, you know, and the opposition to a large extent, and they'll hate me for saying that, but is really, has very little impact on the South African political outcome at the moment. So the reason why people ask for political analysis and why they ask me to come and speak to them, it's usually because they want to have a sense of whether we, exactly kind of what your poll says, whether there is in the foreseeable future a positive outcome or a negative outcome. on a political front. Of course, there are economic issues, etc., that also plays out how things or influences how things play out in the country. But politics in South Africa in particular plays such a disproportionate role, and that people often, that's really what people are interested in when they speak to me. And so when I have to look at whether I think there's going to be a positive or a negative outcome for the country, there is basically one factor that overshadows everything else, and that is Cyril Ramaphosa. It is simply the one question we need to answer. Is Cyril Ramaphosa going to be our president for the foreseeable future? So firstly, is he safe until the ANC's conference at the end of next year? And secondly, is he likely to be state president for the next 5 years? And that is not because I am a particular Cyril fan. I am. I do know him well, and I have a lot of respect for him. But that's not the reason. If you look around inside the ANC and you say, who is there? There are sort of possible successors, and we can talk about those. But if you really look at who is available, who is ready to become president, there is just nobody else that can even come close to Cyril. If you look at his commitment to democracy, his commitment to multiracialism, his understanding of the economy and the markets, his understanding and also stature within the international community, he's just light years ahead. And the point is, of course, I mean, every now and then when I speak to a largely DA audience, especially in the Western Cape, people will say, when I say there is just really nobody else or nobody better, people would say, of course there is. And when I say whom, in the past they would say Musi Maimane, or now they say John Steenhuisen. And, you know, they might be excellent politicians, you know, they might or might not be. But the point is, of course, the ANC in the next 10 years will almost 100% for sure be the majority party in this country. And in that case, of course, they will determine who the president is. So you really have to look who's inside the ANC. And like I said, Cyril remains by far the front runner and certainly the most impressive person. And I would argue even the only one that can take us through this difficult time in South Africa. So that's the main question that should be answered. And that's what I'm going to focus on. The rest, from a political perspective, I'm not saying economically, there are many other questions, but that's not my field. From the rest becomes a little bit detail and of course becomes noise. Happy to talk about it, but that's what I'm going to focus firstly on my presentation. Now, of course, not everybody inside the ANC agrees that Cyril should stay president. And I don't think I'll be saying anything surprising to you to say what you are hearing, all the noise, and there's a lot of noise in the political arena at the moment, and particularly within the ANC, is a major fight back from those who oppose Cyril Ramaphosa. And they have a couple of things in common. First thing is that they're all in trouble with the law. Almost all of them. The second one is that they therefore hate Cyril and they hate his anti-corruption initiatives. And thirdly, because of that, that they want to regain power, not only of the ANC, but also of the country. But of course, to get that, they first need to regain the upper hand inside the ANC. And this is what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing an absolute lining up and mobilization starting for the ANC's next elective conference, which will be end of next year. Now, the problem they have is that they will not easily get the support. And remember, we're now talking of ANC members because they are the ones who determine the outcome of the ANC conference next year. In the ANC, they will not easily get the support of the over 35s, the over 40s. That grouping of members in the ANC is far too conservative. They first of all like Cyril a lot, and secondly, they hate what has been done to the ANC with corruption. So they won't get that support. And so when they look at where they can get support to help them next year at the ANC's conference, they're looking at the younger ones. They're looking at the under 35s or the under 30s, which is a big demographic, not so big in terms of membership in the ANC, but they're very much focusing on that to try and get as many supporters lined up as possible. But of course, to get those guys to support them, they need to radicalize their narrative, because we know that this younger group is far, far more radical than the older guys are. And this is what you often see playing out. This is why they're making such a big deal about land, right? This is why Ace would stand in front of Luthuli House, and when the students are there, says, "Aluta continuo, comrades." when in fact they're marching against his own government. And then he goes and turns around and leads them on their own march, which is, like I said, against the ANC government. This is why you're seeing a lot of this RET faction stuff going on inside the ANC. It is to try and grab the attention and hopefully support of this younger grouping, which, as we know, is a lot more radical. If you actually look a little bit closer in the ANC, so who are these guys that are trying to fight back against Cyril? It is, of course, the RET faction led by Ace and Karel Niehaus, or Onze Karel, as I joke with some of my other Afrikaans friends. And then, of course, that includes also the NKVA guys, of which Karel is the spokesperson. Yeah, I don't think I need to say much more. You're well aware of what they're up to. I have to say, I'm amazed that the ANC haven't got rid of Karel Niehaus yet. Not sure why not. It boggles the mind for me. If any of you saw the video he also issued yesterday, I mean, it's laughable on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's also dangerous. But yes, so that's the first grouping. The second grouping is, of course, the Women's League. I'm not 100% all in agreement about this, but there are many there like Batabile and so on, who of course chairs that, but who's of course not a big Cyril fan for obvious reasons. But they're not a massive influence in the ANC, more symbolic than actual and real numbers. The third person is Duduzane Zuma, who's increasingly trying to portray himself as future president. He recently, over this last weekend again, at his local branch, asked them to vote for him because he wants to become president. Look, he's clearly trying, but let me just be upfront and say, although I'm watching him and watching what he's doing, there is no chance on earth that he will, be a realistic candidate for presidency at the next conference. He's too young. The ANC is too ageist. It's just not going to happen. But you can see again, this is where they're trying to attract the youth, right? The more radicalized youth. That's Duduzane is very much sort of becoming the figurehead there. Of course, then ex-President Zuma, he, and I will come back to him in a little while, far less of a real influence, more symbolic, but of course he makes a lot of noise and he can create a lot of problems, as we will most probably now see in the next few days what he will do or not do. He doesn't have real influence in the ANC more than the guys who in any case supported him, and they're far less than they used to be. But of course, if he really wants to create some bloodshed and so on, he can do it. I mean, that's if that is what he chooses to do, he can create some problems. And then the last grouping is obviously, and they sort of can also be the same with the RET faction or not, is people like Supra from Northwest, Mvula, Tony Ngeni, Andile, Lungiza from Nelson Mandela Bay. So all those are disaffected guys who are not happy. And as you can see, like I said, a lot of problems with the law all over, not your most upstanding citizens in the world. The thing that is very important is that they are fairly small in numbers. They're not, the impression that's often created when people talk about factions, it's almost like it's half-half of the ANC. So people often ask me, will the ANC split? Because they think it's about half-half. No, they won't. That will never happen. People leave the ANC, but the ANC doesn't split. People can leave and do their own thing, but it's not a question of a split. And it's partly also because the numbers are relatively small. So it's not, it's not such a big crisis. The problem, though, is, and this is why we're talking about it, is that they can generate a lot of noise. And in disproportionate in the amount of airtime that they will get from the media, etc. And then, of course, it scares people, and it particularly scares the business world, and it scares foreign investors. So part of their noise, I think, to help people who work with money, to help your clients, to help foreign investors, I think it's quite important, and I do this quite often, is to say, let me explain to you the narratives that they use, so that when you hear it in the media, when you hear that kind of language, that you know where it's coming from, and that it's just part of their narratives, trying to hide the real issues that they are talking, that's actually at stake. So the first narrative that they always use is that they are victims. Look at Zuma, for the last few months, a very good example. Batabile, another example, they took away my pension. Yeah, the reason your pension is not there is because they're deducting it because you had an illegal upgrade at your house, security upgrade. So they become victims. And often then, of course, the race card comes with that. But you will see that I mean, you've seen it since yesterday already when Jimmy Manye started speaking on behalf of Zuma. You know, he's the poor guy, he's the old man, he's 79. He's now have to go in the middle of winter in a COVID pandemic, have to go to jail. He's a victim of a political campaign. He's a victim of irresponsible judges. So that victimhood narrative is very, very strongly there. You would almost never hear Cyril or any of Cyril's guys talking victimhood language. The second one is then a sort of general one, where they talk about the fact that that those who are in power, so Cyril and his faction, are in fact sellouts. They are firstly sellouts in terms of the ANC's policies. So land would be a good example, the fact that they haven't nationalized the Reserve Bank. Secondly, that they work against the ANC's constitution and procedures. That was a good example of that was when they voted in Parliament for the report or going forward about the public protector. So then the whole narrative was this is not ANC policy to vote with the enemy, which is always nonsense. It's just a narrative. And then lastly, of course, is that Cyril and his guys, but Cyril in particular, is in the pocket of big business, and that ultimately big business is, and specifically white business, rules Cyril and tells him what to do. So the old Rupert Tamaleki, as we say in Afrikaans, you know, if they have nothing else to say, they will say that one of the Ruperts called Cyril, and this is why things are happening. And of course, they're doing that because they want to be able to say to their supporters, and also very importantly, their backers. So remember, they get money from people to pay for their court cases, so they want to show that they are relevant. But what they want to sort of suggest then is to say that anything that is decided by the NEC is illegitimate because actually it's because Rupert or some other big white businessman called Cyril and influenced him to then influence the NEC. So it's just to delegitimize it. And of course, it's nonsense, right? I mean, there's nothing like that. And then the third narrative that they use, and you've heard it enormously over the last few days, and you will continue to hear this now because of Zuma, is that they have started to attack the judiciary, where they would say that the judiciary is biased, that they have political agendas, etc. And ACE has been using that, but of course, and Zuma has been using that, and many others, and of course Malema. But of course, it's the typical thing of, you know, when people are in trouble with judges, the judge is the problem. But I have to say, I mean, as an analyst, I also watch sort of orange lights going on that I find worrying. And this would be a very big worrying one, is that when we start attacking the judiciary, when politicians start attacking them, because of course that is what holds our democracy together, right? Is the judiciary. Just as an aside, the other orange light that goes on for me is the militarization of politics and the increasing violence that goes with politics and our political scenario. So the MKVA issue, the sort of violence that breaks up at ANC branches, etc. So that is a very big danger point for me. And then the third one, of course, is the racialization again and the rising in racial tensions, very much driven by the EFF. But to get back, those are the sort of three main narratives that they use: victimhood, accusing people inside the ANC of being sellouts, and then thirdly, the judiciary being biased. So watch out for that. Then you can know it's that faction. Remember that the faction is not that big, so you don't have to be too concerned about it, unless of course Cyril starts talking it. Then it would be a much bigger problem. So then the first question is then the first, you know, we have to ask the first question that I raised is Cyril then safe until the ANC's elective conference next year? And I'm raising that because many analysts continuously hear analysts, you know, where I get WhatsApps with little voice notes where people say, and clever analysts who would then have some inside information that Cyril's about to be kicked out by the NEC, etc. That is nonsense. I cannot, and I've been saying this for almost 2 years now, I cannot see any scenario at the moment that Cyril, or any chance of Cyril being kicked out before the next ANC elective conference, so the next 18 months or so. Remember, it's extremely difficult to get rid of a sitting president. First of all, you can only do it either in Parliament or in the ANC, in the political party itself. So either they need to get a vote of no confidence through in Parliament, which you require a 50+1, and that's 50% plus 1, and you will need the ANC to do that. There's no other way that you can get those numbers, and there's just no chance of that. Cyril made sure that the list of parliamentarians that are there are very supportive of him. There is no roar, even the slightest whisper of that inside the caucus. And the ANC is very uncomfortable with what happened during the Zuma years. So it's just not going to happen. And the second one then is if they have an early elective conference, the NEC itself can't just kick Cyril out. And you need an early elective conference. And for that to happen, they need a majority of the ANC provinces to ask for one. And at the moment, that's just not on the cards. Even if they then go to an early elective conference, it is highly unlikely that somebody else can win at that stage. And I'll get back to that when we talk a bit more about the conference. And then the last reason is that the ANC also knows that they need Cyril to win any election. They are very aware of what the polls are telling them. And the polls are saying you need Cyril Ramaphosa if you want to win an election. So even if it is just for self-interest, that they want to stay in power, that they want their own position secure, so they're not going to agree to get Cyril away. So if you hear this constant, and there was for a long time now a refrain about the National General Council, the NGC, that could possibly get rid of Cyril. In fact, they cannot get rid of Cyril at the NGC. The Constitution doesn't allow it. All they can do there is make life difficult for him and then hope that maybe they can convince more provinces to call for an early elective conference. But at this stage, it doesn't look, they were supposed to have the NGC by the middle of last year. They haven't had it, and they were hoping to do something by now. The NEC is still formally saying that it will go ahead, but they will have to do it virtually. And in fact, if they do it virtually, it would be highly beneficial for Cyril, as opposed to the other side. The other side needs the face-to-face contact. They need the dark corners to hand over the brown envelopes. They need, to be able to wheel and deal. And that you cannot do when you're on Zoom or on WhatsApp, or not so easily in any case. And let me just also say, Cyril still has, all the opinion polls show this, enormous support inside the ANC from ordinary branch members who are ultimately the ones that decide in the ANC, unlike the DA. He has fully support on the NWC. And then on the NEC, even though he had barely got a majority of support after the Nasrec conference, he now by far has the majority of support. So there's nothing happening, that indicates any threat to Cyril in the next 18 months. Doesn't mean it's not noisy. It doesn't mean it's not uncomfortable. It doesn't mean he doesn't need to watch his back all the time. But there's nothing that shows that this will escalate into something far more dramatic, which would, of course, be disastrous for the country. The second question then is, will he be our president after the ANC's conference, end of next year? So there are a few factors that will determine that. The first one is, of course, is he willing to stand again? Or is he going to pull a Madiba on us and say one term? And the problem is, of course, that Cyril Ramaphosa doesn't need to be president, right? He doesn't need, this is what makes him a good president, like Madiba. He doesn't need the money, for sure not. He can make a lot more money in the private sector. His name is well known enough. But having said that, I know that why Cyril wanted to be president is that he wants to finish what he started in Kudesa. He wants to see the economy transformed. He wants to see the economic transformation happening in this country. He wants to see the country be on stable feet economically. And I think it was always clear to him that he wasn't going to be able to do that in 5 years, not after all the Zuma disasters. So I think he was always behaved like somebody who wanted a second term. Otherwise, he would have much earlier have just gone in there and bulldozed everything he wanted to. But he knew that he wasn't going to finish the job within the first 5 years. And of course, now with what COVID has done to the economy and to the country, that has just been set back. So my sense is that he will stand again and that he would want to get a second term. Then whether he would win or not determines on a couple of factors. The first one is, of course, who stands against him. There is nobody in the Zuma faction yet as a consolidated candidate. And certainly nobody, Ace would love to be it, Supra would love to be it, but you can feel there's no sort of chance that they can win against Cyril. But they are, of course, Cyril's more on the sort of moderate side. Certainly Zweli Mkhize until recently was a candidate, but let's see how that now pans out. If this corruption stuff is really a big problem, and it looks like it is, And I have to say, it is something that has always been whispered about in the ANC, that there has been problems around Zweli. If the SIU report certainly does show some problems, he's free to stand, but it will cause some problems for him. He would still be able to stand unless he's in jail, but it will cause problems for him. And then other people are people like Paul Mashatile, David Makura. It will be vital for Cyril to make sure that when it comes to the actual votes, it's fine if they declare that they want to stand, etc., but ultimately that when it comes to his actual the actual day that they're going to vote, that he will make some deals with them that they don't split his support. So it's very important that his support doesn't get split. The third issue is, of course, the ANC membership and how that is compiled. You will recall that was a big issue at Nasrec, because what had happened is that Jacob Zuma, when that period that he was out of the, or asked to step back in the ANC during, I forget the year now, but before Limpopo, was that he then went around and formed all these branches. He used his free time to move around and form branches. And of course, KZN developed into a massive support base, and you got the so-called Premier League provinces that that Ace and Supra and so on was running for him. That is to a large extent changed. It's still there, but it's changed. But what is concerning is that since Nasrec the Nasrec conference at the end of 2017 until the end of last year, the ANC membership went up from just under 1 million to almost 1.5 million. And so this was obviously through ACE's office and under ACE's regime. And so the concern would be whether those now again is kind of a similar kind of process like Zuma did at the time, so that these are all branches and members that are sort of more aligned to ACE, and that would be worrying. The ANC is very much busy with an audit, but that's always a little bit difficult, because short of going to every single branch and telling people to bring the members and showing their IDs, it's a little bit tricky to know if they're all valid. The membership also always increased just before the national conference. So it would be very crucial that Cyril and his supporters make sure that they actually are very much involved in the membership drive within the ANC. So the third issue is the membership drive. The fourth one is then, of course, how these judicial processes play out. At this stage, and I'll speak a little bit about that in a few seconds, but at this stage, it looks like it's falling mostly, the cards are more falling towards Cyril's side, and that's a good thing. And I'll come back to that in a few seconds. The fifth one is if there's still a major COVID disaster. And let me just say, remember, we're talking here about how ANC people are perceiving this, not just the country in general, not the demographic that I presume I'm speaking to mostly now, not sort of middle class or upper class Africans. So mostly rural, with a emphasis on rural and working class people in the ANC or ANC members. And why I'm saying that is because I think the majority of ANC people, from what I can see also from opinion polls and so on, accept that we will have another few waves of COVID. They accept that more people will die. So that's not where the problem is going to lie. They also seem to accept that it will take time to get the vaccines and so on. So that's not where the problem lies. The only way that I can see a real disaster developing for Cyril is, in fact, if something goes wrong with the vaccines. So if you suddenly get a major death toll because of something that happens with the vaccines, that something is not properly approved or something is pushed through or something very big contaminated. And of course, apart from the human factor, they also know how catastrophic that would be politically for them. So this is why caution is necessary, not only, as I say, for obvious safety reasons, but also from a political perspective. So COVID most probably won't be the biggest thing, because it's unlikely that we'll see any problems with the vaccine at all. But just to keep that in the little back of your mind. Then the last factor that could play a role on whether Cyril gets re-elected is, in fact, the local government elections. Remember, that's where Jacob Zuma's real problem started, was with the last local government election, where the ANC support nationally fell dramatically, and then people got nervous. And as I said to you earlier, there is a very clear understanding in the ANC that they need Cyril Ramaphosa to win the elections. And so if they actually do extremely badly in the local government elections, whenever that is going to be, then that could pose a little bit of a problem for him when it comes to the next ANC election. But overall, I mean, some people in the ANC are suggesting that he will stand unopposed. I think that is unlikely, given people's ambitions, etc., and just wanting to cause trouble. But I think as things look now, but we are still 16 months out, it should be um, almost a foregone conclusion that he will get a second term if he indeed wishes to stand. Let me just get to 2 more points really before I'll go into the questions and answers things, or 3 maybe. The first one is just now the court case around Jacob Zuma yesterday, the result. Of course, I think none of us can deny that this was a gigantic result, and the judgment has certainly rattled through the political ranks, I think, of all the political parties, but certainly also the ANC. It is a major win for democracy. It does say uncategorically, after this horrible time that we had with Zuma, where everybody just acted with impunity and thought, that they can just do, politicians, that they can just do whatever they want, that this is where it stops. It stops. Even the president is now going to jail. Ironic that he chose to go to jail on this issue, when in fact there are most probably much bigger issues coming for him down the line. But so be it. It's now the end of the line. In terms of the ANC's reaction, I think the majority of, and also from what I can see from reaction on ex-MPs groups and so on, which I'm part of, there doesn't seem to be a problem there. People seem to just totally accept it. On a personal level, obviously a little bit of sympathy for him, especially those who know him quite well and for his age, like I said, whether he's, and etc. But I don't think there's going to be any problem from the ANC side. Of course, the RET factions, his supporters, the Kolniaus, Ace Makashules, etc., are going to drive the narrative of victimhood and injustice and try and encourage some support. But the problem is that they won't be able to gather enough support. You'll see some toying happening. We saw that with Alan Busak way back. We saw it with Tony Ngeni. We saw it with Andile Lungisa, and it will most probably be bigger. And you might see a standoff with MKVA at some stage. But the government will handle this. They can't afford not to handle this. My sense is that Zuma will in fact go. I agree. I was listening very careful to Makma Raj yesterday, who I know, but who also, of course, was Zuma's spokesperson for a while and knows Zuma quite well. And his feeling was that he'll most probably hand himself over without too much drama, because it would be important for him to be able to play this victimhood role. And, it's difficult to see that if he puts himself out as the aggressor rather than the victim. So my feeling is that that's what will play out in the next few days. But yes, astonishing move in the political domain. Ace, of course, cases is building up against him. Ace is definitely trying to win some time with all his cases against the ANC. I'm not a lawyer, but my sense is that things are moving against Ace. And I would be surprised if he wins this case against the ANC. And if he does, it will only be on a technical point about a procedural issue within the ANC. The ANC will fix that and they will do the same thing to him again. So he's clearly trying to win time, hoping that he can get to an NGC if it's still being held, hoping that he can throw his lot to which is what Zuma did many years ago, then go to the branches and say, do you want me to be reinstated? And that the branches then does it, which is then very hard to counter for the NEC. But I think the ANC is now in no rush to do this NGC. So I think that might not work for him. And then I think also, then he will try to stretch out all the court cases as long as he possibly can to do the same thing at the next elective conference next year, to try and see if he can get the support that he wants with the branches. But the clock is ticking. The ANC is not helping with the legal costs. The ANC doesn't have money at the moment, so they can't help with anything. So I think increasingly, Ace is in very, very serious trouble. And like with Zuma, I don't think he's going to get the support from the masses. There's not enough of an appetite, not enough of a loyalty towards Ace, even though he does have some support. The next issue I just quickly want to touch on, and then I'm almost finished, is the issue around local government elections. Of course, we know that Justice Moseneke is launching an investigation. He's doing some hearings at the moment around it, whether we can really have the local government elections. And it's not only so much about whether COVID would still be a problem at the end of October. It's not so much that. It's actually whether you will be able to campaign sufficiently, all the parties, in order for it to be democratic and therefore fair. And in fact, given that it's already so late, can it be fair given that people have not been able to campaign as much? This is, of course, something that would bother the ANC and the EFF more than many of the other political parties. The DA and the Freedom Front Plus most probably have less of a problem, getting to their members technologically through cell phone messages, through Zoom, Skype calls, and so on. But the ANC and the EFF certainly relies a lot on the face-to-face, door-to-door, and then, of course, the mass meetings. And this is why the EFF is very keen, amongst others, to get the local government elections postponed. Just one thing around that is that, of course, they're running out of time. So if Moseneke, as he says, his report will come out towards the end of July, I think he said he's hoping to have it finished by the 21st of July, you need at least, and I mean, that is a really big squeeze, but legally, you need a minimum of 60 days to get a constitutional amendment through. And of course, they need one if they want to postpone it beyond October. I don't think the numbers is going to be the problem for the ANC. I think the EFF will go with him, so they'll get the 2/3 majority. It's just a question of time, whether they will have enough time to do it. So they will have to rush that quite quickly. If it does go ahead, the by-elections tell us that the ANC seems to be holding their support. Difficult to judge. Local elections are really difficult to predict, and opinion polls are notoriously bad doing that. But if we just go on some of the recent by-elections since November of last year, the ANC seems to be holding support, maybe even increasing here and there. The EFF is holding, with some interesting developments in KZN, where since the last national election, they're showing some growth there. The DA has largely, and particularly outside the Western Cape, but even a little bit in the Western Cape, has been punished by voters. They are definitely in serious trouble and will have to really make a serious effort about where they want to go with the party to decide that before specifically the next national election. And to a large extent, the Freedom Front Plus has picked up what the DA has lost, in particularly when you look more inland and not so much the Western Cape. I have no question that the Western Cape will stay DA, and that the Cape Metropole will stay DA. The question is with what majority, and then the question is to what extent the DA will lose in the smaller municipalities, and then particularly more towards the inland provinces. The EFF is also struggling a little bit, partly because of the fact that they can't mobilize. Malema has gone back to holding a little bit of court with the journalists, but of course they can't do their usual big rallies and their big meetings. But what you are seeing is, of course, that because they are in trouble and they know they will jump on every small little possible thing that they can. Also to hide, of course, their own political issues around BBS and so on, and corruption issues. And they will jump on anything at the moment. And this is why certainly we will continue to see this escalation in racial issues when they arise. Of course, they can't jump on something if there isn't a legitimate issue, but certainly they would escalate that very fast, and faster than it would have been in the past. I want to finish here by just briefly saying, I know that there's in general, and I don't know if I've got the results of the poll yet, but in general, and I would be surprised I'll be pleasantly surprised if it comes out and saying a very positive sort of outlook on South Africa. I know that we're in a very difficult time, and COVID has certainly been something that nobody could have predicted, and it has been disastrous around the world, and it was always going to be more disastrous for us. We just do not have the buffer. We do not have the shock absorbers in our country economically, capacity-wise, etc., to deal with such a big disaster as COVID has been. So yes, I understand that people are really, really negative. I also understand when you look at the economy that there are enormous challenges, and big fear and anxiety around that. However, because politics plays such a big role in this, I am actually quietly optimistic, because from a political perspective, and again, if you take it back to the question around Cyril, we are in a much better space politically than we have been for a very, very long time. We're in a better space than we were, despite the fact that the optimism is not so much there, than we were even just after Cyril was elected, because he's been able to consolidate support with his own party. He's been able to move forward with those corruption drives of him, which is just mind-blowing. He's been able to get the ANC to do things like to agree on things like getting money and support from the IMF and the World Bank. Again, things that we never thought would be possible. And so there's a lot of things that have moved since Cyril have become president. And of course, we are in an infinitely better place than we were during Zuma's regime. So if you purely look at a political place where we are now, politically, we are in a much better place than we've been for a long, long time. And this is why, despite, and I share the frustrations beside the anxieties, which I always share, despite that, I think from a political perspective, there is a lot of reasons for hope. We are politically on the right track. And I think if you also look at the team of financial people that Cyril has around him, even financially in the fact of his own knowledge, you cannot have a better team than to try and take us through this economic crisis than Cyril, his team like Tito. Praveen is still there on the sideline. I know there's some questions around him, but in general, he's financial cluster and financial advisors. So on that slightly optimistic note, let me stop there and see, let's rather go into some questions and so on. Charles, if you want me to answer some there.
Melanie, yes, I've got a couple. I think the first one that I just want to start with is that you actually mentioned there isn't somebody as good that can succeed Cyril. So I think for some of our clients that might actually be a little bit concerning. So one of the questions we've also had from somebody was, will the likely successor be, or even if I change that maybe around and I ask you, if you had to appoint somebody, who's the one or two people that you believe could be great successors for Cyril?
So let me say who first of all thinks that, or sort of fancies themselves as successors. Well, I mean, apart from basically 1 million leaders and ANC branch members. So the sort of candidates that get mentioned, and that certainly is pushing their names and so on, is Paul Mashatile from Gauteng. So let's see, there's also sometimes whispers around Paul. So let's see. The one thing you can know is the moment they stick their heads up, above the parapet, if there are any skeletons, they will come out. So Paul is certainly there. David Makura's name has been mentioned quite a bit. I think Lindiwe Sisulu fancies herself as a candidate still, but I don't think she has any chance of making it. Then the other, so these would be people for end of next year. The other person more on the longer term that I'm watching, so 5 years from now, is somebody like Sumani Sol. Sumani is the premier in the Northern Cape. He's a very interesting politician. Really impressive stuff that he's done there. He's kind of Madiba-like in what he's doing. So it's very, very interesting to watch him, and he's definitely raising his profile. The problem for him is that it's very difficult in the ANC when you come from such a small province to gather enough support countrywide to be, to become president. But I think in about another, give him not next year, but give him, another 5 years, and he could be a very interesting person. And then the other person that I'm watching, again, he's too young now, but give him another 5 to 10 years, is somebody like Ronald Lamola, who's the Minister of Justice at the moment. Ronald is again a very interesting character, and is, as far as we know, clean and interesting and powerful. So could become a very interesting, but again, at the moment, I think he's still in his late 30s. He's too young. So Ronald and Sumani for later on. For the immediate future, like I said, Zweli was there on the horizon, Zweli Mkhize. But yeah, I think depending on what comes out now, it might not be such an easy catch for him anymore.
Thank you, Melanie. Melanie, then you've spoken actually quite a bit about the conference that's being held end of next year. So one of the things that I've also picked up where you spoke about the Premier League provinces and the big work that ASAP actually done the previous time in order to secure like votes. Then I just want to ask, if you look at Cyril, you've spoken about the audit that they're doing to better understand the voting district. Do you think they're doing enough? What should they actually do? What's the critical factors to make sure with all those delegates that he win and that it's not going to be a narrow margin again of 179 votes?
Yeah, that was too close for comfort, let me tell you. So like I said, so how it works, of course, is that the delegates to the conference, both to the NGC and the National Elective Conference, but the NGC is much smaller, or the policy conferences are much smaller, but they all work on the same principle, is that depending on the branch sizes, depending on the provincial membership sizes, proportionally, they then get a certain amount of delegates to take to the conference, and ultimately the conferences decide. The individual members vote and they decide. The problem was that this issue around slates that developed, where provinces basically said, we want you to vote for the following candidate as a province. And that was because, so then you have to take it back, because the branches that got elected way back were too many were on the wrong, let's say the wrong side. And they then elected the provincial leadership, which then were on the wrong side, let me put it that way again, and therefore that they then gave the wrong mandate. So what you want is you want to avoid that from happening yet again. That mustn't happen again. The ANC is trying very hard to put new regulations, and I think it is, in fact, Kgalema Motlanthe that's doing that. That they're bringing new rules in for the national conference so that they don't have these slates, that it's a far more free and fair kind of elections. And this is the problem that the ANC has. The DA works slightly differently, and one could argue that that's maybe a better model that they have, where there is much more influence and intervention at a higher level. So there's more vetting, there is more interviewing processes, etc., etc. They work differently, where the ANC regards it as a strength that they are so super democratic, that they work from the bottom, but eventually, with the way that it's actually panned out, it isn't democratic anymore. It is actually the influence of provinces, etc. So it is absolutely important that Cyril's supporters and Cyril's faction, that they make sure that from now onwards, when there will start to be a massive membership recruitment drive, that they are involved in it, and that they are very much pushing that. So it obviously helps with Ace not being actively in the position of Luthuli House, so he cannot manipulate this, as sometimes there's been suggestions that things have been manipulated. They have put the membership system electronically, so it's no longer this very problematic thing where people had to get a stamp from an F&B branch, but of course very quickly stamps were made, so everybody had stamps from F&B branches. It's not that anymore. So they've tried to put lots of stuff in, but ultimately it's going to be that Cyril's crowd has to mobilize, and they have to get the membership right. And this is where the issue around money and the fact that the ANC's run out of money is becoming a problem. Because of course, to mobilize to the extent of that the ANC needs to mobilize in the whole country, it costs any political party a lot of money, and the ANC in particularly a lot, and they just have zero money at the moment.
Thanks, Melanie. Melanie, then I think I want to move over to a couple of which I think is maybe a little bit tougher questions. So the one client actually sent through and he said, corruption seems to be embedded within the ANC. And I guess even myself, if I look at corporate SA, example would be Stana as one corporate SA, not necessarily always clean, but are we seeing progress? What the client is asking, and then also what actions are Mr. Ramaphosa taking to stop corruption?
So this is the one where I'm actually feeling a little bit positive. I think you're right. I think what happened, of course, under the Zuma regime is that people, like I said, just started stealing with impunity because they took their cue from him, right? They knew what was happening. And so everybody was trying to enrich themselves. The sense of entitlement developed. And then, of course, you had people like Sean Abrams, and the NPA became captured and so on. So nothing happened. And then, of course, when you get away with it and everybody's getting away with it, it becomes embedded. You're right. And it's not only in the ANC, it was also in the civil service. And yes, I agree. And this is a point that people often make in the African forums where I sit back, is that people often say, but you also have to acknowledge that a lot of that's happening in the private sector. And Steinhoff being one, obviously the one big disastrous example, but there are many, many, many others. For example, digital vibes, the fact that they could quote the government, the kind of money that they were quoting them, 150 million for doing what, it's extraordinary, the kind of, it ended up being more, but, to arrange a couple of press briefings. So of course, massive problem. Cyril acknowledges it, the ANC acknowledges it, it's not so. I think we need to be careful, though, to say everybody therefore is corrupt. That's not the case. That's not the case. And I would even argue that with the way that the people are now, you know, that a very large chunk of those that have come now into power again and into influence are in fact not corrupt. And I know a lot of people, and most of them would never, you know, even think about corruption. I think the one thing that Cyril has been extraordinary, and it was a huge political risk for him, but he also understood that the country cannot go forward if he doesn't address it, has been, in fact, this fight back against corruption. It has been first to change people like the NPA, to make sure that they are there, all these appointments of special investigative units, but most importantly was the stuff that he did inside the ANC, where he made it very clear, if you are involved in corruption, not only are we not going to help you, not only are we not going to just turn a blind eye to it, you are going to have to step back from your positions. And this was him. This was very much him that he convinced the NEC. You will have to step back from your position. And if you are found guilty, you are out. That's it. And we are not paying your legal fees. We are not helping you, you know, like would have been the case under the Zuma years. And you know, the thing about that is, you don't even need, people will often say to me, yeah, but who's now gone to jail? Of course, in fact, a lot of people have been now charged, a lot of people, civil servants and politicians. But you don't need gazillions of people to go to jail. In fact, most probably, it's most probably not the best thing if hundreds of senior ANC people go to jail, because people will then play the victimhood and people will start reacting to that, you know. But the thing is that what it did already, and what this thing with Zuma will also do now, is it rattles through the ranks. If people step into line, and if, you know, a few years ago when I would walk in Parliament and speak to ANC people, they would be whispering to you and say, you know, that one is busy with that and that and that, and that one's busy with that, but we can't say anything because, you know, Comrade President, you know, and they would say things like that. It's a totally different ball game at the moment. People would go, like, people know there's a new sheriff in town. People will say to one another, yeah, see you in jail, right? That kind of thing. There's a total different atmosphere and so on. And that's important, because often it's more a culture that develops within any political, we've seen it worldwide. And that's the thing that needs to change. So I think, you know, I think this is the one place where they've made enormous progress, and where he will continue. And he knows his political legacy hangs on this, and of course the country's future hangs on this. So I think even Zondo, you know, is so on. And so yeah, I'm on the corruption side. I mean, it's depressing, it's frustrating for everybody, and particularly when you watch politics, when you see, not again, you know. So you see the thing around Zweli, and you literally just want to throw your hands in the air and go, I wrote a column about this. Why on earth, for a stupid second-hand bakkie, you know, whatever the bakkie was, I think I said it as Isuzu, and a lot of people were very angry with me because apparently it was a Land Cruiser. But even a Land Cruiser bakkie, why would you risk your whole political career for a Land Cruiser bakkie? Or for somebody to come and give you a DSTV decoder and install it in your house? Seriously, you know, when you earn that kind of salary, why would you not just pay for the stupid thing, you know? And I think, you know, so it is incredibly frustrating and devastating to a large extent, I think, for any citizen in this country, if we think what could have been done with the money that had been stolen and disappeared. But I think the line has been drawn, and that I have no question about. Doesn't mean there won't be more corruption. Of course there will. But because where there's money and power globally, you'll find corruption. The question is whether it will be treated and whether it reduces and becomes no longer a way of behaving in politics. And I think that is definitely the case.
Melanie, and then the other one, we actually got quite a couple of questions. And I must say, even myself as well, it's quite close to my heart, would be unemployment and poor education. And that's potentially two of the biggest factors which are needed in creating stability in the country. And you even spoken earlier about the radical group within the ANC, the supporting base of the EFF. And if I've just got to look at the youth actually entering the job market in South Africa over the next 15 years, if you're actually going to look at the number of people, And then on top of that, even if you look at the tax base of South Africa, the amount of people that's actually formally employed that's paying the tax, what is government actually doing to address the unemployment, and then even prior to that, the education levels or the quality of education within South Africa?
Yeah, and you know, this is one of those things that really concern me too, and particularly education. And it's one of the things that I'm really furious, one of the many, but one of the most important things that I'm really furious about with the ANC, because this was one of the things that they could have done right. There was no reason not to have done this right, and they didn't. They messed this up. And we have a terrible problem now in our education system. And you know, we are turning out kids after school who are not properly educated, who struggle to get any further education. And often the reason for that is also just purely teachers who don't do their job, who don't rock up. You know, there are obviously real issues in terms of socioeconomic circumstances, a culture of learning lacking in certain communities, because, you know, there's just no parents with books, etc., etc. So those are things, those are difficult issues to solve. But things like teachers not rocking up, teachers, you know, I'll never forget, I recently helped a young woman I paid for a course that she wanted to do post-schooling. And one of the problems, she really wanted to go to university, but one of the things was she did really well. She got B's and even some A's, and I think the worst was a C in most of her subjects, except she failed maths. And as you know, if you fail maths, you're always in trouble with most courses. And when I asked her, what the hell happened with the maths? She said, the teacher never came for the whole year of matric. So never in that whole grade 12 year did the maths teacher rock up at school. Now, you know, and this is a child who, against all the odds, really single mother, really poor from the townships, got A's and B's, and then didn't pass maths because the teacher didn't rock up. So education is one of the big problems. And in fact, I can't even give you a solution because I think the ANC is not solving that very well. I think there's a big crisis in education. And I don't, you know, I'm not quite sure how that is going to be solved. And I think it's one of the places that we really also as civil society need to put a lot more pressure on government. This, of course, does to some extent translate to unemployment, but not necessarily, it's not the only factor, because of course, if we were creating enough low skill jobs, of course, we could catch them, right? But the jobs are not created to the speed. A lot of that, of course, has to do with the economy in general and the state of the economy and growing. And I think what they are trying to do is just at all costs to try and get the economy to grow. COVID obviously has been a big disaster around that. They're trying to make it easier for business to do business in South Africa, all those kind of things that they are putting in place. And you have to understand this is not something that they take lightly, because the ANC, and you will hear, if you listen carefully to Cyril, any big speech that he gives, any sweeping speech that he gives that's on multiple issues, he will always, always, always bring in the youth. Because the ANC understands that if they can't get the youth vote, they will not be in power much longer. Remember that we know that young people usually get interested in politics at the age of 25. It's usually when they start paying taxes. This is globally the case. So under 25, not so interested. Around 25, suddenly you see a pickup. Remember that crowd was born, the ones who are turning 25 now are the ones who were born in post-1994. So that crowd is now for the first time really getting into, or post-1990. They are the first ones, so they're the post-democratic young people. They are the first time now coming really into play into the political arena. And they will only now start really registering. And remember that demographic bubble sits at the bottom, and also remember that they are a lot more radical. The ANC understands that if they can't win these young ones, they are not going to be politically in power for a long time. So, and they understand that one of the top issues for young people are education and, of course, employment. And this is, so there is a drive within the ANC and the ANC government to try and resolve this. Education, of course, doesn't happen that overnight, and that's a big problem. And then unemployment, I mean, you're well aware of all the steps that they are trying to take around that. But of course, you know, COVID has put a very serious dent into that.
Melanie, then I've got a last two questions I want to ask you. So I know our time is nearly done. The first one that I just want to ask you quickly, both of us stays in the Western Cape, and sometimes from a municipal perspective, you feel you actually staying in a little bit of a bubble. So the question that actually came through was, a lot of municipalities are in a very difficult position. Are we making progress in establishing good and fully functioning municipalities, especially taking cadre deployment and potentially the lack of quality senior staff or management staff at municipalities into account?
That's another place which is a disaster. I mean, that's another level of government. You know, as much progress as I think they are making nationally and even provincially with things like corruptions, trying to move away from cadre deployment and that kind of thing, local government's a total different ballgame. And in fact, I think, you know, I feel a little bit, I think back a lot because I was part of the committee that wrote with Pravin Gordhan, wrote the local government legislation. And at that time, you know, the idea was, of course, as you know, the ANC wanted strong national government and very strong local government, but then as a we gave in to the National Party as a compromise. We gave in to the National Party to our very strong local provincial governments, which was partly to keep the Western Cape out of the ANC's hands. The point is, though, that it didn't turn out that way. You know, the strong local governments, so all the best politicians and so on went into national, and then to a lesser extent into provincial, and then those who were left a year and a half later were really not skilled politicians. And then, of course, with Black Empowerment, a lot of the skills were moved out from the administration side. And then under Zuma with corruption, this was the easy place to steal money because there were no eyes over it, and there's enormous amount of money that goes through local governments. And this is why so many people, especially outside of the Western Cape, and you're right, we are in a much different circumstances in the Western Cape, are struggling a lot in local government. It's going to take a massive, it's not that they, from what I can hear and what I can see, the ANC is very much aware of it, right? It's not, and it worries them greatly. And of course it worries them, particularly in an election year, but it worries them because service delivery determines so much of your other indicators like health, even education, gender issues, violence issues, all of that gets impacted by your local service delivery issues, your stability, because of course protest actions usually happen around that. So all your indicators to some extent goes back, or most of them goes back to local government. So they're very aware of it, but it's a massive and a gigantic effort. I have to say, I think these recent court cases where they actually are allowing communities to interfere on it is very interesting. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And I think also communities need to do more of that. But it's extremely unfortunate. And I think it is one of the, most probably one of those places that's going to take the longest to get fixed because of the complex nature of how many there are, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
Then Melanie, just the last question before we're going to hand over to Annette, so we can maybe just keep it quite short. So the question basically came in, what will government need to do to change in order for the private sector to fully support government? And there I can maybe just refer to one or two things, even if we look at the low levels of the business confidence index, just as an indicator. And then secondly as well, it seems like we've got a couple of like own goals. If you look at section 25 of the Constitution regarding land reform, which has been ongoing now for a number of years. If you can maybe just answer that one, please.
It's a difficult one to answer quickly, but I'm going to try. I mean, I think here again, Cyril plays a key role because he understands business. He talks business language, right? He understands it. He understands the markets really well. And he is really trying with his financial cluster to do whatever they can to make it easier for business, you know, the ease of business, doing business in South Africa, to register, to try and support business as far as they possibly can, and to do as most handoff, you know, and allow business as they possibly can to function. So they're trying. I mean, they are trying. I also think, though, business has a responsibility in this, you know, that we can talk ourselves down in South Africa, you know, and one of the most difficult things I have is talking to foreign investors, and the negative criticism they get is from our guys, our business guys. You know, I go around the world. I sometimes do roadshows in America. And when I ask the guys what will get them to be interested in South Africa, they would say things like, we need to see that your financial sector is really moving money inside South Africa. If they don't have the confidence to move it, why would we? So I think there's also a bit of the business sector trying to, you know, coming to the table, and also, you know, for the sake of the country, trying to help. And I think there is a lot of that happening, but I think we can see a lot more of that. You are right that things like policy issues, like the land issue, is a problem, and it of course originates back in the ANC's faction fighting. I'm not worried about Section 25's things. I think it will be fine. It's either not going to go through because they can't get the support. This is again where you have to trust Cyril. Cyril understands that if this thing goes the wrong way, it will be catastrophic, and that we will look like Zimbabwe the next day. So he understands that, and he's just not going to allow a major disaster like that to happen. But you can see again how I take it back to Cyril. So you know, a lot of that, this is why I've been focusing on that, but not worried about Section 25, maybe a little bit more worried about something like the NHS, the National Health System. I think that's something we need to watch, and I'm not sure that everybody's watching that close enough, and a lot more concerned about that one than the land issue. I don't think that's going to be an issue. Not worried about something like the nationalization of the Reserve Bank, won't happen, not in the foreseeable future. Yes, so as again, you know, these things are often being used by that other faction as a way of trying to keep Cyril busy, distracted, and also maybe put him into problem with their own supporters. So again, let's watch the issues that are really problematic, and try and, I mean, it's hard with the media, but you know, and try not to get too freaked out by the media.
Melanie, thank you. I think it's time. Let's move over to Annette, CEO of PSG Asset Management.
Morning, everyone. And this is the time where your confidence takes a knock when you see the ticker go down as people are leaving the webinar. So thank you so much for most of you staying on, and thank you for your support and interests. We picked a political topic for this webinar because we've had so much noise around economic news and around COVID that I think it's easy to forget the underlying progress that's taking place. Of course, it's, having listened to Melanie for the past hour, it's very hard to be positive and feel comfortable about where we are, but I think it's undoubtedly we have made some progress. If you relate that back to the market, I think for me the one takeaway would be that there are still quite a lot of risks out there, but the wholesale move to either income funds or offshore assets, which is something that we've seen happen throughout a lot of clients around the country, I think that is perhaps a short-sighted and a one-stop approach that I think may not be suitable for the current environment. So even though the market remains on the surface to be not cheap, we, as you're well aware, are finding exceptional for the first time in a decade, exceptional opportunities in quite a lot of sectors in the market. We still prefer SA equities as our preferred asset class. We have got a very good diversification across our portfolios, but this lockdown may just provide the opportunity one gets to buy into some of those again, when we've seen a very strong straight line recovery in that part of the market over the past 6 to 8 months. So these shifts never happen in straight lines, and I think what we're going through at the moment is actually giving us a little bit of volatility and a little bit of opportunity. So I think the message we want to leave you with is that if you're going to navigate through the current situation, we think that while multi-assets are not on the surface the most popular products at the moment, we think they're the ones that are going to have the fullest toolbox in order to navigate through the uncertain environment. We hope you found this of value, and that it has enabled you to set aside some of the very noisy narratives that are out there at the moment and look at the substance of some of the things that are being achieved. We're all impatient about it, we're all frustrated about it. It's taken way too long for anything of substance to happen. But I hope that we've been able to demonstrate to you that there has been some progress. And thank you again for your interest. Hope to see you at our next webinar.